Okay, next is the Standards and Assessment Committee report. Chair Gravitt.
You ready, Chair?
Almost.
Come on. Just kidding.
Okay.
Ready. I have to tell you, I laughed out loud at your jokes, and laughter is a good thing. So thank you for that board message.
I've got many more, but
well, as a junior high teacher, I was completely, I completely enjoyed them.
Okay, I have the summary of actions up. I think we're ready. Go ahead.
Okay, so this is the Standards and Assessment Summary of Actions that, from October 2nd. The first actionable item is 11.2, which is access recommendations supporting underrepresented, historically marginalized, and underserved students. This came before the committee. It was a memo from the Access Committee that, in general, included 5 recommendations. 1, to denounce racism. 2, to provide professional learning on equity, literacy. 3, to help us conquer the digital divide. 4, to provide support for digital navigation for families. And 5, to provide curricula that supports inclusivity, marginalized groups. The motion was unanimous, and all of these things align. I just want to point out, align with our board mission, Portrait of a Graduate, including our focus on civic responsibility, communication, collaboration, teamwork, and respect. So with that, the motion before the board is the committee moves that the board accept the recommendations in the Access Memo, supporting underrepresented, historically marginalized, and underserved students.
The motion before us is to accept the recommendations in the Access Memo supporting underrepresented. Sorry.
It's hard to say, isn't it? It's weirdly hard to say.
That word, historically marginalized and underserved students. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Earl.
Yes, I would like to make a motion that this is referred back to committee for further dialogue.
Okay, is there a second to that motion?
I will second that motion.
Okay, the motion is to refer this back to committee. Is there discussion to that motion?
Can I speak?
Member Earl?
Yeah. So after our last committee meeting, there was some dialogue that went on that I took a few minutes. I read several books over the last several weeks so I could have a deeper understanding of what some of the terminology was used in this particular memo. And there were some questions I asked last week, and some of those questions had to do with specific definitions, because some of the reading I did, there were numerous definitions that I think the public is either not familiar with, or I think as a board we need to be familiar with exactly what the memo is asking. And so I've had some dialogue with Access members and as well as our staff, and I feel like this discussion needs to be made there in the work needs to be done there with our committee. I feel like we might have raced this through a little bit without a thorough analysis. So I'm just asking that that's what we do, so that we can solidify some of these definitions and some of these things that that are being suggested in this documentation.
Board Member Belknap.
Thank you, Chair. I actually appreciate these comments. However, one of them that I'm kind of concerned about, and maybe Jenny can help me here, is number 5, because it's talking about curriculum and academic content. And have we vetted these? And so on that front, I would, oh, wow, what is this? I think I'll turn that off. Holy hand, hold on.
How does it feel in space today?
Shining light, Lord. Light is all I have.
Go to the light.
That's right.
Don't go to the light. Okay. And so I guess if we're adopting this whole thing, I do have some questions, and I'd actually appreciate the idea of having some definitions, and that our standards and assessment could put these definitions together and then look at the relevant curricula that is out there, the resources, and the academic content. I'd love to see that put together before we just grab this and take it. So thank you.
Board Member Gravitt?
Yeah, I just want to comment. I want to speak against this motion to send it back to committee and just remind board members of a couple of things. These recommendations are not implementation, they're recommendations. And then the other thing I wanted to say is I'm wondering, because we're getting some questions that I think Dr. Patty Norman could give some context to that would help with just helping board members understand about definitions, et cetera. So Dr. Patty Norman, could she speak to some of these concerns, Chair?
Yes, that'd be fine. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for these questions. Deputy Superintendent of Student Achievement, Patty Norman. In looking at some of the questions that were being asked, I know that the Access Committee, and I know that we have some of the members on here today. We have Rosanna and Brian, and we have Clastina, and I think we have one more Access Committee member on here as well today. That could respond to any of the questions that board members might have. In reference to the recommendations, one of the things that we had talked about in committee is that in accepting the recommendations, then it really doesn't speak to the implementation or what that will look like in moving it forward. And so the question that Access Committee would then have is, are we amending their recommendations because then they wouldn't be the recommendations of a committee, or are we asking the questions about implementation? So when we've asked the questions before about boards or committees that advise the board, it's about taking the recommendations and then moving forward in the direction that the board wants us to with those recommendations. So I think that's the question that is being asked by Chair Gravitt, is in looking at the recommendations, are we asking them to revise their recommendations? We've also really had some work being done on the Equity Steering Committee for creating a culturally responsive workplace. And we're creating those definitions right now with a lot of stakeholder groups. And there's a lot of work that's being done on those. And at some point we can share those with any board members as we're moving along with those definitions. So I just wanted to ask about those things and then see if there's any other questions moving forward.
Board Member Hanson?
Thanks. Frankly, I don't think we did our job as the Standards and Assessment Committee. At least I didn't do my part as far as thinking through what the implementation part of this looks like. And I think that we should refer it back to the committee so that we can not change the recommendations, but maybe make some suggestions, recommendations to the board from the committee as far as how implementation should take place to make this more of an actionable item. So that would be, I would be in favor of kicking it back to committee and allowing us to do that.
I'm just going to quickly interject something here, just maybe it might be helpful procedurally, but when an advisory committee sends something to us, these aren't implementation strategies. They're recommendations for us to say, do we want to move forward and come up with some things that would move in this particular direction as they are advising? Anything that would be an implementation strategy would come through the board. So for example, if there was curricula that was approved, it would come through the board. If there was a resolution would be written and go through committee. And so these aren't things that will automatically trigger an implementation strategy. This is just saying that we accept the recommendations and then the work of implementation would come through us as board members as we move forward with these 5 items. So just an item of clarification.
Yeah. Could I respond?
Yeah.
Chair? So I think accepting the list of recommendations from the Access Committee is perfectly acceptable. And I think that's what we did as a committee, is to accept those recommendations to pass them on to the board. But approving them for implementation is another thing. And if we can clarify what we're doing here today, maybe that will help. And maybe what the vice chairman or vice chairwoman just emphasized to us clears that up. So maybe we can move forward with that understanding.
Thank you, Board Member Hanson. And to clarify the wording of the motion, it is that the committee recommended that the board accept the recommendations. So it's not an implementation strategy that we are moving forward with, but just accepting these as recommendations. Board Member Scott Nielsen.
Okay, I do have a couple of questions because in reading through here, it talks about administrators, what is this, taking courses to learn about themselves, to raise awareness and promote change. Change is a very broad word. I would like some very clear and concise definitions about what change is, what that's supposed to mean. And then something else in here that I was looking at as far as educators, administrators are provided anti-racist, bias, equity, literacy, professional learning. What does that entail? So there's some questions there that I have as well. And then the last one I will talk about really quickly is I think we're under the assumption. I haven't been teaching a long time, but this is I think year 16. I've been in schools with a lot of diversity, and when I read in here, it says that something that changes the system. Well, what about the system is not working? Because I don't believe that the system is inequitable or racist. I know that there's people that along those lines, but as far as the system goes, I want specifics on what changes to the system is this recommending. And so I would very much like to see this referred back to the committee for more clarification before we vote on it. That's all.
Board Member Gravitt, and just a reminder, we are voting. Our current motion on the table is to refer back to committee. So, Board Member Gravitt.
So this is, as the committee chair, I just want some clarification, because if it goes back to committee, I'm hearing that there needs to be questions or things need to be changed. And I guess kind of going to what Dr. Norman was saying, what would be the purpose to send it back to committee? Because these are recommendations that didn't come from us. They came from Access Committee, and we have that committee for a reason, because we are not them and we do not live in their shoes. And so to refer it back to committee, I'm trying to look over the document and wondering what exactly needs to be changed, etc. And then also I'm thinking about some of Scott's questions, and just a reminder that these are things that would be fleshed out in the implementation. We are just accepting the recommendations. And so it just doesn't, it's not making sense to me to send it back to committee, because I don't know exactly what board members would want to be done. Either we accept these recommendations or we don't. And after we move off of this motion, I could share some of the things to respond to Scott's response in terms of if our system has racism in it. But I just wanted to kind of get clarification on what exactly needs to be done in committee, because I don't think it's our place to change the access recommendations.
Board Member Gravitt, or excuse me, Board Member Davis.
I'm not qualified to answer a question. Do you want to after someone answers her?
Okay. So, sorry, Board Member Gravitt, do you want, in this question, are you hoping to get a response from those who want this to go back, who have proposed that this go back to committee? Is that your intent right now?
Well, yeah, my intent is to try to understand, because I think for some board members, and maybe it's just me, I'm really trying to understand what work needs to be done. What would be the purpose of sending it back to committee? And then the other thing I just want to add, if some of those questions, especially what Board Member Nielsen just asked, I think some of those questions could be handled if we want to ask Rosanna Benali Stagg to answer some of those questions. I think she would be great to talk through those, and that might help board members understand. But yes, I would love a response so that I can know what work would need to be done back in committee.
Board Member Nielsen, do you want to speak to that question?
Okay. Now, excuse me, I was just off for just a second. Ask me the question again. What was the question? I wasn't expected to be asked a question. Go ahead.
That's okay. Basically, you stated that you wanted to send this back to committee to get some questions answered. What would be the intent or the work of the committee, in your opinion, if this went back to committee?
Like I said, and I think Scott Hansen put something on there before. Are we just saying that we're receiving this? There's a difference between receiving this and accepting this, right? So there's some clarification that we're accepting it as saying that, yes, we agree with this, or we're just saying, yes, we've received your recommendation. I would like some clarification there as well.
So a reminder, the motion states that we would, the board would accept the recommendations. That's the wording in the motion.
Okay, I oppose that, but we can move forward.
Okay, let's see. Board Member Davis.
Yeah, I've had multiple times people say to me that we work on standards, not curriculum. That's what the local LEA is supposed to do. So I guess I'm just looking, can someone answer that? Or would something have to be shifted for us to accept number 5, whereas we work on standards and not curriculum? And also, I guess it's confusing, again, the language, because I've heard it both ways. By accepting this, it means we're moving forward in this way. Can we move forward on that? And what does that mean? And we're getting emails from people saying that it includes this, and so. And I'm like, I don't see that in there, but maybe we need to clarify or get some clarification from the Access Committee, some examples of what would be there, so that people don't have perceptual jumps to what they believe we're voting on today.
And Chair, could Rosanna speak to that?
Yes, the only caution that I would provide is Access Committee has provided some recommendations. They aren't, in this recommendation, there isn't curriculum decided. And so I would be cautious that if we get into what it is that they're thinking, like curriculum ideas, that may not eventually be what the board decides to move forward. And it might not even be like the board decides on curriculum, such as Board Member Davis said, that maybe it's just here's some highlights of things that LEAs may want to consider as they choose curriculum. And so I think it's just being very cautious that as we move forward in this conversation, that we're not, in our conversation, we're not trying to put too much implementation meat on this as well. So, so if Rose, does that answer your question, Board Member Davis?
Kinda. It kind of does, but I guess whatever the expectation is that comes out of this is the bigger. Maybe the Standards Committee could clarify what the expectation is once we get this. But I'd like to amend the amendment.
Okay.
I move that we send this back to the Standards Committee to provide the additional information that board members are seeking, but that they come back with a draft on number 1. The USBE adopts a resolution denouncing racism and racial inequalities in our Utah schools. I feel like, a few months ago, I was thinking we need to do this. Governor Herbert sent out a great, sorry, I'm speaking before you accepted the motion. Should I wait?
So just for clarification, you're asking the committee to move forward with a recommendation that we haven't accepted as a board yet.
So I guess I'm asking to accept number 1. That's my amendment. At least.
Okay, so am I understanding that you want to, so the motion right now is to refer back to committee. And so we might need to finish that before we try and split the recommendations, because that's not the motion that's on the table currently. The current motion on the table is to refer this back to committee.
Okay, so I saw a notice from Board Member Belknap that said that we could divide that and accept a portion of it. So is that not the case? It has to be accepted in its entirety.
So the motion to refer supersedes the motion that's on the table. It's a completely separate motion. It's not an amendment to the other motion that was on the table. It is its own motion to refer. And so right now we are only considering that single motion, which is the motion to refer this back to committee. And so once that motion is finished, depending on the result of that motion, we have the potential to split up this if it doesn't get referred to committee.
Okay.
Lorraine, did I misrepresent that in any way?
That sounds right to me.
Okay. So is there any discussion to the motion to refer to committee? Please check your hands, and if you only want to speak to the motion to refer to committee, please leave your hand up. Otherwise, take your hand down for the time being. Okay, thank you. Okay, Chair Huntsman.
Yes, and this is a clarification question, and I don't want to speak according to my professional or legal opinion here, and so I would like to pose a question to our AAGs on the difference between receiving and accepting from committee the obligation that this board has if we receive it in one way or another. So the question is that I have for our AAGs, the difference between receiving and accepting, and is there any obligation once we accept that we're concurring or we're proposing to endorse and move forward? So, Madam Chair, with your permission, will our AAGs respond to my question?
Brian, can you respond to that, please?
Sure, I can try. That's an interesting idea or question. What's the difference between receive and accept or approve? And we're not talking about approving the recommendations. We're talking about it. I think
not here.
Isn't the word we're talking about receive, Vice Chair Cummins? Is that the word in the motion?
The word is actually accept.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, Chair Huntsman, my sense is that's to kind of to receive or to take. That's not necessarily to approve. And so I will go back, made the motion and find out, was the intent of the motion to accept and approve, like endorse, or is it just to receive and then turn around and work on them on these recommendations? So it might be helpful to clarify the intent of who moved this motion.
And then I'm just going to add a couple things that are in the chat currently, is that receive is not a term that we often use under Robert's rules. So, but by definition, accept, thank you, Scott Hansen, is to consent to receive a thing offered. So just to clarify that in there. Board Member Gravitt, would you like to speak to the intent? And there is also a suggestion for a possible amendment, which is accept for consideration, which if that is the intent of the committee, if that would be acceptable. So just those are some things in the chat that might help the conversation. Board Member or Chair Gravitt.
Yeah, the only thing I would again say is that the intent for us, at least my interpretation, is we are taking a look at these recommendations. We are listening to them. We are saying, we hear you. We accept the recommendations, but we are not even at the place of implementation. There's a lot of work to do before implementation, and any kind of implementation would require action and great discussion from the board. So the intent is to say, we see them, we hear them, we recognize the issues, and we are happy to denounce racism and accept some of these recommendations as things to consider. That's my understanding.
Chair Cummins?
Yes, Board Member Earl?
As the motion was mine originally, it was to acknowledge their work. It was not necessarily just that this is the work of a work group, not our work. And so it was to acknowledge their work. But we can, I think probably, well, we have a motion on the table, but I think Board Member Belknap's wording is more reflective of the intent.
Okay, so I apologize for letting us get off course again, remembering that our motion on the table is to refer back to committee. Board Member Bolter.
Thank you. I was just going to comment that the discussions that we're having is really interesting, and it feels an awful lot like a committee discussion. So I really feel like perhaps it does need to go back to committee just to clarify some things, and it would, so that other board members have their questions answered. And in the past, it has felt like when we accept something, we are saying we accept with the intent to implement. And so prior to doing that, I really would like some things answered. And so when it goes back to committee, then Chair Gravitt could then either go back to Access and say, hey, let's work on these definitions. Whatever that looks like, I'll leave it to her discretion, but it would be nice to have some more further clarification on this document.
So if I understand you're correctly, you're saying that if we refer this back to committee, you want the committee to begin the implementation process?
No, I'm saying that we are right now, I would feel more comfortable having it go back to committee before we as a board accept this document, because typically when we accept a document, we are accepting with the intent to look towards implementation. So I would feel comfortable going back to committee, getting these answers, these questions answered, getting a full, what are the definitions? What do these things look like? And answering the board members' questions. It just seems like there's a lot of questions and it probably needs to go back to committee.
Superintendent Dixon?
Thank you, Vice Chair Cummins. So I want to just make sure that everybody saw Assistant Superintendent Nelson's commentary in the chat. And as we think about where this goes, whether it's working on it further, directing staff, or going to committee, it is a board policy 5001, which established the committee to make written recommendations to board leadership on other issues of importance for educational equity of students that merit consideration by the board. So going back to purpose, we do have opportunity gaps, and in trying to address those, it's, how do you get at that? So what are you implementing? What would you like staff to do? Those are some of the questions I think Board Member Nelson was getting at. So given that, I want to make that statement publicly. As you all started to get a lot of correspondence about this issue, and that means something was posted likely on social media. So in looking at some of the social media posts, there is some implications or suggestions that Access is some organized group outside of the board. They are they're your committee. They are your advisory group that you nominate, approve people who serve on that committee to bring you recommendations. So I just want to make sure that was in the public square for anybody who might think otherwise, that it'd be really clear that they're your advisory group. So whether it's committee or wherever that happens, I think the conversation, you're trying to continue the conversation and get clarity, and it can happen in a number of ways.
Thank you. Board Member Lear?
Thank you. You know what? I thought I wanted to send this back to committee, and then I read the actual letter from the Access Committee, which says that we wish to advise USBE, which is kind of an odd word, but to consider the following recommendations. So all this is doing is asking the USBE to consider the following recommendations. And the committee, in accepting the letter from Access that we have earnestly tried to encourage from Access, all that the committee is recommending is that we now consider their recommendations. We don't implement, we don't receive, we don't imply that there's implementation, we just consider their recommendations. And I think with that language, I feel very comfortable in accepting the committee's recommendation that we now consider the ideas that Access is putting before us. Thanks.
Board Member Gravitt?
Yeah, and I hope, Brittany, stop me if this isn't okay. I'm worried that there's going to be a vote to send this back to committee. And I feel a real urgency to have this move forward because these are real students. These are real people that are being affected. And I don't know, maybe I'm not seeing clearly, but I see nothing controversial about saying we recognize that some of you are suffering or don't feel welcome. And Brittany, what you can stop me on is I want to read you something. I have pages and pages of information from students that are saying, please, we need help with this. So I'm going to just read this little thing. And again, Brittany, stop me if it's not appropriate. This is from a student. Amid the mid stages of COVID-19 entering the United States, I, as an Asian person, have had very traumatic experiences with racism. When I went to the store, I was called a terrorist. When I went to the store with a mask, I was accused of having the virus. When I was at the ER, I was accused of having the virus. When I simply posted on my social media platforms, I was accused of bringing the virus. These are what I personally have been through just from the coronavirus outbreak. This Tuesday at school, I was called CHINC, the C slur, by someone who directly looked at me. In elementary, my parents would be made fun of because of their accents. Kids would call my cultural food smelly. Kids would pull their eyes back and say, I look like you. Whenever I would say something to them or tell them to quit saying those things, they would invalidate my feelings and my emotions as a joke. And these things happened in school. Racism against Asians has been so normalized that I have been taught to absorb them and hate myself and laugh at myself too. I remember growing up and wishing and wanting to be white because it would mean I wouldn't be made fun of. I would be normal. There are many like me who have gone through these experiences and even worse. Words that kids say and teachers allow them to hurt us minority groups. The N word, the F word, the C word, the R word hurt Black students, LGBTQ students, Asian students, students with disabilities, to name a few. I think teachers should become more educated about racism, look inside themselves deeply, and help stop kids who reinforce racism. I just wanted you to hear a perspective from one student, and I can give you many, because all this is saying, board members, is that there is an issue, maybe not for you, maybe not for me, but let's listen to those kids who are screaming for help. Just because they're the few doesn't mean it's not happening. This isn't a controversial document. This is a document that says we love and value all our students. So that's all I'm going to say on this.
Board Member Thorpe?
I'm against moving this back to committee. And I think what I've heard so much from my colleagues of color and from students who are in these circumstances facing racism is the same thing over and over again, that there's a committee convened, that there's recommendations made, that things get stuck in the bureaucratic process, and we never move forward with any system change or anything that makes an impact for students. So I agree that we shouldn't be the reason for holding this up, and that accepting this for consideration is a very small thing we can do for these students.
Board members, just do a quick hand check to make sure you still want your hand up. Board Member Newell?
I'm going to a little vulnerability here. I was the third class in 1968 to be bused to desegregate our school system in Southern California. My experiences are very similar to the students to this day in 2020 that they're going through, where we had both parents, instructors, people in the community that would create environments that were not conducive to learning. And these environments were created by misunderstanding and not diving into a realization that there are some experiences and there are some, references that some people just cannot relate to based on barriers that are within our society. So I really implore everybody to accept these recommendations, and we can work through these things, but this is a painful place. It's not like this is just happening today. This has been going on for centuries, to tell the truth. And we have an opportunity to be mongers of change, to do something different that other people will not do, to be able to create a system that is inclusive, that is equitable, that shifts the narratives that are holding back so many people in our society. And it's critical that we take these first steps to move in that direction.
Board Member Earl?
Yes, I do have a list of questions, and I think those are ones that could be addressed in committee meeting. And I'd be happy to send those on or read through those currently if you want that publicly read. What would you like done?
So first, we're addressing the should we send it back to committee?
That's exact. Yeah. So isn't that the question asked? Because
so if your questions are specific to the document, please hold that until we get to that main motion. If we send it to committee, the questions can go to committee. If we don't send it to committee, then you'll have a moment to ask a few questions.
So, Vice Chair Cummins, I have a question then, because Board Member Gravitt asked the question, what will we do there? And that's why this is pertinent to the particular motion currently.
So I think her question was general, like, are we going to be revising this document? But if we pass the motion to refer back to committee, then those questions would go to that committee. If the motion stays here and we keep it here, then you'll have an opportunity to ask those questions.
Thank you. My point is that those questions would be what would be talked about back in committee. It's not like it's just going back for no reason. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Newell?
No, my hand was still up. I'll remove it.
Board Member Hanson?
Thanks. I feel like the conversation is getting a little bit twisted. And maybe just from my understanding, I can walk through my intent and feelings. If accept means definition number 1, consent to receive, then I'm fine with accepting this document and we accept it, but then what? There's no other action on the table today for the board. There's nothing else that we can do to move this forward, except that we received it for something that we're going to consider in the future. The intent and the reason that I would support moving it back to committee is to bring it to the board with some concrete examples or concrete suggestions, recommendations of how it could be moved forward. I feel like we already accepted in committee without doing that, and we shouldn't have done that. We should have put some thought into what that means to accept in the second definition of the word, to recognize parts as valid and correct and talk about how to move that forward. So my preference would be that we move it back to committee, but if the understanding is the definition of accept, and that's really what we're talking about here, we're arguing about what the definition of accept is, and all of us are right because there's 2 definitions of accept, one meaning to receive it and one meaning to recognize it as valid and correct. And the valid and correct part is a little bit harder to do without having some real discussion about definitions and details and what that really means on the ground. So that's my 2 cents.
Chair Huntsman?
Yes, I'd like to call the question.
Okay, the motion before us is to end debate. Call the question. Please vote.
Brittany, can I interrupt? I'm so sorry.
Sorry.
I just want to say, before we make this motion, I've asked a couple of times if Rosanna could speak, and I feel like we're talking around it and not letting the source say something. I don't know if it would be appropriate since we've asked, or if we need, I'm sorry.
So this motion is to call the question on should we send it back to committee. So if it goes back to committee, she'll have the chance to speak with the committee. If it stays here with the board, then we'll go there. So this current motion is just call the question and debate. And
okay, I wanted her to have a chance to speak before we make a decision, but I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
We do need a second on that.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. Is there a second now that we've all voted?
Second.
Okay, so the motion is to call the question, and the motion before us is to send this back to committee or to refer to committee. So just for clarification, if you need to change your vote, I haven't looked yet. Okay, so the motion The motion to call the question passes with 1 no vote, with Board Member Gravitt being the no vote on that. Okay, so now we are back to the motion, which is now, we won't debate, which is to refer, the motion is to refer this back to committee. Please vote. Okay, that motion fails. Yeah. The no votes, board members, please don't take, please leave your vote up. Thank you. The no votes are board members Cummins, Gravitt, Thorpe, Lear, Cannon, Newell, Marsh, Huntsman. That's 8 votes for no. The yes votes are Earl, Hanson, Belknap, Davis, Haynes, Scott Nielsen, and Bolter. Okay, so now we are back to the committee motion, which is to accept the recommendations in the access memo supporting underrepresented, historically marginalized, and underserved students. Is there any discussion back to that motion? Michelle Buse, did you want to speak to this?
Yes, if I could. I did some quick research while you were debating the issue as to it under Robert's Rules of Order, the equivalence of terms. And this is what Robert's Rules of Order states. It says, as applied to an assembly's action with respect to board or committee reports or any of their contents, the expressions adopt, accept, and agree to are all equivalent. That is, the text adopted becomes in effect the act or statement of the assembly. And so it would be that you adopt the act of considering those actions that the committee, the access committee has asked you to consider. So I hope that that at least answers one of the questions that you had. Thank you for allowing me to share that with you.
Thank you. Board Member Belknap.
Yeah, so I'd like to, sorry about that again. So I would like to make that amendment that we consider instead of accept.
So your amendment is to add the word consider the recommendations?
Yes, if that's accurate, what AG Buse just said, that we can use the word consider rather than to accept.
And I will accept that, or I will second that. This is Board Member Nielsen.
Or Michelle, does it need to say except for consideration?
May I speak?
Yes, please.
In accepting it, that's what you're doing because the recommendation of the access committee was to ask you to consider these items. And so your correct motion would be to accept the access committee's report. And their report wasn't to make recommendations to you. It was to ask you to consider these things. And so your correct motion would be to accept or adopt all mean the same thing. Accept and adopt in action mean the same thing in terms of their report. I just wanted to clarify to you that in doing so, you would simply be accepting the responsibility to consider is what the access committee was asking you to do. They were not asking you to implement anything. They were asking you to recommend anything to schools. They were simply asking you as a board to consider something. And so you would just accept their report.
However, Chair, I actually do like the verbiage. It may be repetitive, so I would like to keep my motion as to accept for consideration.
Okay, so and that was seconded. Thank you. The amendment is to add the words for consideration. Is there any discussion to that amendment? Board members, okay. Just check your hands and make sure you want to speak to the amendment, which is to add the words except for consideration. Board Member Hanson.
Thank you. I think that's an important amendment because the way the motion is worded, it doesn't say to accept the memo, it says to accept the recommendations in the access memo, and there are many recommendations in the access memo. There are 5 enumerated ones, and then the recommendation to consider, I guess. So I think it clarifies things just to say that we're going to accept it for consideration, and then we can go forward and take appropriate actions.
Board Member Gravitt?
Yeah, I just want to speak against this amendment just because of what AAG Buse talked to us about, because she just told us that the definition of accept is to the act of considering. And so, I think we need to keep it clean instead of saying the board accept for consideration. Like it's almost like we're being redundant and repetitive. And I think we stick with what the legal definition is, and accept means to consider. So I speak against it.
Okay. So check your hands. Board Member Davis? Board Member Belknap?
Yeah, I just think that what was said was it's accept does not mean to consider. It's that their letter said that they would want us to consider these. So it wasn't that accept means to consider.
Board Member Davis?
It was said in the comments there are 2 definitions or 2 things allowable in Robert's rules. One is accept and one is accept for consideration. Is that the case, and what's the difference between the 2?
I think what Michelle Buse was saying was that in the memo it's asking us to consider. So when we accept, when the motion says accept, then we are accepting for consideration based on the wording in the memo. Board Member Hanson's clarification was the motion talks about recommendations, not just the memo, and so he feels confident in adding the word consideration there as well. I think they all mean the same thing. I think everyone's just trying to be clear that we're accepting for consideration these 5 recommendations. And so
I have a second question. If you need me after the other questions.
Board Member Davis, did you say that again?
I have a second question.
Go ahead.
So if it all means the same thing and it can help everyone get on board with moving this forward, then I'm fine with putting that in and moving forward with the vote. But I am asking procedurally, is there a way to start on number 1? Not just accept for consideration. If we accept for consideration, does that mean that we will start on all 5 of these things? Because I think we're way behind the 8 ball on a statement. I think we should have made one a long time ago. Is there anything procedurally that I can do right now that would be appropriate to actually act and not just accept? Or does the act of accepting start the ball rolling on all of these things? Or do those all require separate motions at later meetings?
Sorry, if you don't mind, if we continue with the motion that's at hand, which is to add the word for consideration, and then we can get to your question procedurally. Is that okay?
That's just fine. Thank you.
Okay. So the amendment at hand is to add the word and consider after the word accept in the motion. So it would read, the committee moves that the board accept and consider, accept for consideration the recommendations in the access memo. Is there any further discussion to that amendment? Seeing none, please vote. That motion passes with 2 no votes. The no votes are Board Member Thorpe and Board Member Cannon. Is that everything you need, Lorraine?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, we are back to the committee, the motion, which is that the committee move that the board accept for consideration the recommendations in the access memo supporting underrepresented, underrepresented, historically marginalized and underserved students. And just to answer Board Member Davis's question on procedure, any board member can send a request to have something put on the committee. Also, as these are board recommendations, they can be considered by staff and brought forward to committee as well. And so all of these can be considered and brought individually or together onto individual board meeting agendas, task force work, etc. So does that answer your question, Board Member Davis?
I understand you saying that staff can begin working on this without waiting a month for another vote to begin working. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. They can bring things forward to the executive committee to place on an agenda.
Then that means we wait another month before we start drafting. So there's nothing I can do today to start drafting now and have the board vote now because that's not the exact thing on the agenda.
As far as unless somebody wants to correct me, what's on the agenda is for us to consider this. And so it can be on our next agenda as an agenda item with a draft. So it could be in a committee with a draft next month if that's what's requested. So are there any other questions to the motion? Okay, I see none. The motion before us is that the board accept for consideration the recommendations in the access memo supporting underrepresented, historically marginalized, and underserved students. Please vote. Board Member Earl. Board Member Nielsen. Okay. That motion passes. Sorry, I'll go ahead and read the yeses. Board Member Cummins, Hanson, Thorpe, Gravitt, Belknap, Lear, Cannon, Davis, Newell, Haynes, Marsh, Huntsman, Bolter. The noes are Earl and Nielsen. Is that everyone? Okay. Thank you. Okay, next on your committee report, Chair Gravitt.
Okay, thank you. So the next actionable item is 11.3. This is the board resolution 2020-1, a resolution establishing the official position of the Utah State Board of Education concerning the SHARP survey. So we had quite a good discussion in committee a couple of months, maybe even more than that. And then after all of that hard work, the motion before the board is that the committee moves that the board adopt board resolution 2020-1 draft 2. You're muted, Brittany.
Man, now I got to say that all over again. Okay. Okay, the motion before us is the board adopt board resolution 2020-1 draft 2. Any discussion to that motion? Seeing none, please vote. Okay, that motion passes. Okay, the ayes, board members Cummins, Gravitt, Earl, Thorpe, Lear, Cannon, Davis, Newell, Haynes, Marsh, Nielsen, Huntsman, Bolter. The noes are Hanson and Belknap. Okay. Do you want to continue?
Okay, next item is 11.4. This is the Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee recommendations. Motion before the board is the committee moves that the board accept the Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee recommendations.
Okay, the motion is that the board accept the Assessment and Accountability Policy Advisory Committee recommendations. Is there any discussion to that motion? Okay, I see none. Please vote. Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Please continue.
Okay, skipping to item 11.7. This is the instructional materials for implementation of human trafficking prevention and awareness requirements for youth. Motion before the board, the committee moves that the board approve the minimum expectations for human trafficking awareness and prevention instructional materials for youth, draft 4.
The motion is that the board approve the minimum expectations for human trafficking awareness and prevention instructional materials for youth, draft 4. Any discussion to the motion? Board Member Nielsen.
Yeah, I want to commend this. This is becoming more and more of an issue in today's society and even in local areas. So this is something I'm strongly behind. I know everybody's going to vote for it, but bringing this up and putting this forward, it's very commendable, and I want to thank whoever was a part of that. That's all.
Board Member Belknap.
Yes, I have a question. Do we have this for the adults also in our system? Something like this?
That's a great question.
Do you mean like, so these are just the minimum expectations? It's not what the teachers will be using, or?
No, sorry, let me be more clear. Okay. Do we have something like this for our staff, our leaders, our teachers, that they can be more aware of human trafficking and what to look for?
Can I have Corby respond to that, because he'll give you a better answer?
Thank you. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Corby, if you're present, whichever. Corby, if you're present, if you'd like to speak to that, please.
Chair, this is Assistant Superintendent Voorhees.
Go ahead.
Corby Eason has actually left our agency. He resigned to become an assistant principal in Davis School District last week. But Brian.
That boy, Corby.
Yeah. Yes,
awesome.
It's great for them, serious loss for us. But Brian Olmstead can speak to the question.
Thank you. Go ahead, Brian.
You bet. So yes, we have standards for instruction for school personnel. In fact, that's required every 2 years. And also that LEAs have available materials for parents. And so those were actually approved earlier by the board. So these standards are the third set coming before you.
Thank you. Board Member Earl.
Sorry, my comment was just that we had, I think it's been just a little bit, but we previously approved those, so I'm glad we found some. Sorry.
Thank you.
And there's Corby. If you'd like to hear from Corby.
Corby, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I finally got in. I was trying to get in as the question was being asked. I had to find the password, but if there are any other questions, I'm here to answer.
Okay, we miss you already.
We do.
Okay, there's no further questions. The motion before us then is that the board approve the minimum expectations for human trafficking awareness and prevention instructional materials for youth, draft 4. Please vote. Board Member Nielsen, are you an aye?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Sorry, I thought it was on there.
Just wanted to double check. Okay, that motion passes unanimously. Chair Gravitt?
Okay, so that concludes that committee report. Are you ready for the next one?
Brittany, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead. I'll get it pulled up.
Okay. So we had a very long, but oh my goodness, an excellent special USB Standards and Assessment Committee on turnaround. And thank you to the committee members and staff who worked so hard to do this work. You can look through, there were lots of motions because we went through it decision point at a time. And so I hope you've had a chance to look through some of that because it answers a lot of questions. So I'm just going to start with, let's see, I'm going to start with the motion before the board. But, okay. Well, let me do this one first because I think there's a couple. The committee moves that the board directs staff to work with legislators on a bill file for the 2021 general legislative session, allowing the board more flexibility to determine the entry criteria for the school turnaround program in board rule.
Okay, so the motion is that the board directs staff to work with legislators on a bill file for the 2021 general legislative session, allowing the board more flexibility to determine the entry criteria for the school turnaround program in board rule. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Earl?
I just have maybe a question, maybe I don't want to hide a particular motion, but I do. So I guess I make a motion, then we can discuss it, right? Is that appropriate?
So you want to amend the motion?
To include that we consider the, not assessment, but the data we use for turnaround from each school.
Where in the current motion do you want to add that?
Let me look real quick. I apologize. Let's see, the committee moves to the board.
Board Member Earl, could you just repeat what
and
you wanted
so right
to add?
after the word and, I'm sorry, Jeff, did you have a recommendation?
Go ahead.
So after the word entry criteria and, oh, hang on, and data that is used for, yeah, well, I guess for the school, it's there already, right? And then I can speak to that if I get a second.
Can you repeat your motion?
So it would be entered right there. So the
after criteria, is that what you're saying?
Enter criteria and data that is used for school turnaround program.
Okay, so
someone is suggesting identification. Yeah, I guess it is identification, right? Identification. Yes, that's better. Thank you.
So the amendment would add the words and data that is used for the school turnaround program, and then add the word turnaround program identification in board rule. Is there a second to the amendment?
I'll second that. Board Member Gravitt.
Okay, any discussion to the amendment?
Can I speak to it?
Yes.
So it's becoming more or clear that there's a need to go beyond just our assessment at the end of the year. And that, I think some of the things we've talked about today earlier, that data needs to be not robust in the amount of data that we're collecting and storing, but robust in what we're allowing districts to provide or LEAs to provide for success in their schools. And I just think there needs to be that dialogue, and we need to start moving in that direction. And so I would encourage us to add this component to be considered. Yep.
Okay, Board Member Belknap?
Yes, I'm hoping that we can do this without making a motion on it, but Darren made the suggestion that we board more flexibility to determine the identification criteria and data that is used for the school turnaround program.
I'm good with that. I just think we need to expand that, however we word it.
And without objection, Chair?
Yes, if the amendment maker is fine with that, then you can go ahead.
Okay. And the original maker.
Well, this is an amendment, so the original maker has no say. Okay, Board Member Lear, do you have a comment or question?
Yes. Also, without objection, could it be data R instead of data is?
No. Okay. Okay. Okay, so the amendment, sorry, I have a ton of background noise going on right now. Okay, so the amendment before us is to read as follows. The committee moves that the board direct staff to work with legislators on a bill file for the 2021 general legislative session, allowing the board more flexibility to determine the identification criteria and the data that are used for a school the school turnaround program and board rule. Please vote. I don't see any other discussion. Please vote. Board Member Newell. Okay, that motion passes. Please don't take your vote out yet. Quite sorry. That motion passes. 1 no vote. Board Member Hanson. Okay, that takes us back to the main motion, which now has disappeared from my screen. Thank you. Back to the main motion, which reads, the committee moves that the board direct staff to work with, let me close my door. Hold on just a second.
Go get him, Brittany.
Sorry. The committee moves that the board direct staff to work with legislators on a bill file for the 2021 general legislative session, allowing the board more flexibility to determine the identification criteria and data that are used for the school turnaround program in board rule. Any discussion to that motion? I see no hands. Please vote. Board Member Gravitt. Okay. That motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Chair Gravitt, if you'd like to continue.
Okay. So the second motion before the board is the committee moves that the board approve R277920, School Improvement Implementation of the School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act, Draft 4, on second and final reading.
The motion is that the board approve R277920, School Improvement Implementation of the School Turnaround and Leadership Development Act, Draft 4, on second and final reading. Is there any discussion to that motion? Okay, I see no hands. Please vote. That motion passes unanimously. Thank you.
That concludes the report. Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you.